All right, Paul's letter to the Colossians. In this little video, we're going to talk about, like always, the historical context and some important passages from the book. So, who is the author? Paul. Like all of these letters, Paul is the author. Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians from prison. Like Ephesians and Philippians, we're not sure exactly when or where he was when he wrote the letter. But a lot of scholars think it was likely in Rome. We do know that he was in prison because at the end of the letter he says, "I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you." And a few other times in the letter he also makes reference to this fact that he's in chains, in prison, for the same reason as the other letters, for sharing the gospel. The audience. The church in Colossae. So, unlike Ephesians and Philippians, Paul did not start this church. And we see in Colossians chapter 1, verse 7, he says, "You learned it from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on our behalf." So we can see that the church was actually started by a man named Epaphras. And actually, Paul had never even met the people in this church. In Colossians 2:1, he says, "I want you to know how hard I am contending for you and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not met me personally." So there's this church in Colossae. There were other churches that he also was in communication with, but he didn't actually start the church, and he had never even met the people in this church. He only knew about them through Epaphras. So, if Paul didn't have a personal connection to the church, why is he writing this letter? Paul is writing with his apostolic authority. Apostolic authority means that Paul was an apostle. He was chosen and sent personally by Christ, and that gave him a special authority in the church at that time to give teaching and to correct false teaching. And that's what he's doing in this letter. He's correcting a false teaching in the church. And while he never explicitly defines what the false teaching is, we can discern what it was based on how Paul emphasizes certain things throughout the letter. And so now we're going to look at some important passages that help us understand what was Paul teaching and what were the false teachings going around that made Paul teach what he was saying. All right, so the first passage is from Colossians 1:15 through 19. It says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him." So here we can see that Paul is really emphasizing the fact that Christ is above all, that he is the firstborn over all creation, that all things were created in him, that he is the beginning, he is the head of the church, and that he has supremacy. Christ is above all. Another thing that Paul emphasizes we can see in Colossians 2, verse 8. He says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ." So here Paul's saying human philosophy, and very specifically for their context, like Greek philosophy, is not the final answer. It's not going to give the answers to life that this false teaching was saying that it would. Likewise, in Colossians 2:11 and then in 3:11, he says, "In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision not performed by human hands. Your whole self, ruled by the flesh, was put off when you were circumcised by Christ." And then he goes on to say, "Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all." And so these two verses we can see he's kind of emphasizing the fact that Jewish tradition is not the only way to God. And these verses should remind us a little bit of Galatians, right? The teaching apparently had some similarities to that of the Judaizers. Then going on in Colossians chapter 2, verse 18. Sorry, the chapter and verse number isn't there. This is from chapter 2, verse 18. He says, "Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. Such a person also goes into great detail about what they have seen. They are puffed up with idle notions by their unspiritual mind." So here Paul is kind of calling out this idea of worshiping angels, or people claiming to have this secret knowledge of having, visions that only they've seen, and making other people feel bad for it. He's saying that's not good. That's not what the gospel is about. So, if we take these verses and put them together, we can see that, putting all the pieces together, we can say that the Colossian church was facing a false teaching that mixed Greek philosophy, Jewish legalism, and Oriental mysticism. And all of those things diminished the importance of Christ. So instead, Paul focuses on the gospel and Christ as the center of everything. The letter to the Colossians is all about Christ, how Christ is the center, Christ is supreme, Christ is above all.